Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. Recently I was asked an interesting question by one of the fencers at my own fencing club. So this person wanted to know what I thought was the context of use for de Grassi's fencing system. So in other words, they wanted to know when de Grassi fencers would actually use their skills. And also they specifically wanted to know if I thought that the system was designed to face off against itself, in other words, for two de Grassi fencers to fence against each other, or if it was more designed to counter other systems that were in circulation at that time. So I thought in today's video I would present my answers to these questions as a kind of case study of the context of historical fencing treatises. So even if you don't study de Grassi's system yourself, you might like to think how would these questions apply to other fencing systems that are out there? How would you answer these questions in terms of whichever system it is you are practicing? So let's get to it. Right, so before I actually describe my answer to the questions, we need to consider some factors that we need to analyze. So the first thing we need to consider is how popular was the fencing style. And this is important because if it was a very popular style, then obviously the chances are that a fencer might have to fight against somebody trained in the same system. However, if it was a more specialized or niche style, then most likely the fencer would be taking on people using other styles of swordsmanship. The other factor that we need to analyze is what the author, what the treatise writer actually described as the context of use. In other words, what kind of situations was the author intending to train his readers to encounter. So if we can analyze both of these things and then think about the techniques inherent in the system, then we can begin to come up with an answer to the original questions. So, point number one, how popular was de Grassi style fencing? First thing to say is that de Grassi's treatise was in relatively widespread circulation. So we know that for several reasons. Firstly, there are multiple surviving copies of the treatise, which means it must have been printed back in the 16th century in relatively large numbers. Secondly, the treatise was exported to England and translated and republished in an English language edition in 1594. So for a treatise to cross international boundaries like that, it must have been reasonably popular and well known. And finally, de Grassi's treatise is actually referenced by several other fencing authors. So for example, numerous later Italian fencing writers actually refer back to de Grassi's book as being one of a number of key texts which demonstrated the development of the Italian tradition over time. So the book was well known in de Grassi's day and subsequent to de Grassi's day. Second thing I can say on this particular topic is I personally believe that de Grassi's system was not entirely original or unique. So de Grassi himself said that he spent some time traveling around Italy, he learned from different masters, and he extracted what he thought were the main elements of the true art of defense and then codified it in his book, in his own system. So in order for him to take a hold of these ideas, these concepts or principles, they must have already been in circulation, which makes logical sense. And in fact, if we go back to Camillo Agrippa's treatise, we can see that in his analysis of different guard postures and different tactical approaches to fencing, he actually describes other fencing masters as already teaching a style like de Grassi's. So fencing from a low ward posture with a hand withdrawn right the way back outside the thigh. So it's a characteristic guard stance of de Grassi's system, already being referenced back in 1553, almost 20 years before de Grassi published his book. So, in other words, it's my strong belief that de Grassi's text is representative of a wider North Italian rapier fencing style, of which his book is just one snapshot of the style. In other words, de Grassi was just an instructor who happened to write a book about it, but there were probably many other instructors teaching the same, or at least a very similar style of rapier fencing. So, in other words, de Grassi's system was, as far as I'm concerned, very popular. However, we should also note that the more traditional cut and thrust approach to fencing, as epitomized by the Bolognese school masters like Marozzo and Manciolino, was still in circulation in Italy when de Grassi was active. And in fact, for example, Dalla Gocchie actually published a book in this style a few years after de Grassi's book went into print. So the two the two styles existed in parallel at the same time. So that gives us two possibilities there. So de Grassi fencers may have had to take on other people fencing in the early North Italian rapier style, and they may have had to take on people fencing in this Bolognese-esque cut and thrust style. Right, next thing to consider is what does de Grassi himself have to say about the context of use for his fencing style? He basically mentions three main situations where it could be used and a fourth of secondary importance. So the three main situations are street brawls, honor dueling, and military campaigns. Now, he actually advocates his readers not to use their skills in street brawls, but don't be confused by that. I really think that's him just covering himself for legal reasons, and also for moral reasons. He didn't want his fencers to go out and start fights. However, there are numerous anecdotes in his book about street violence of one sort or another, so it's pretty clear that his fencers, as a minimum, had to be prepared to defend themselves in a street violence context. Honor duels and military campaigning were, of course, legal or at least socially tolerated, socially acceptable. So these three between them give us the context of use for de Grassi's skills. Now, he does also mention recreational fencing. He's a little bit dismissive of it. He does say it has its place and it's a nice activity, but that the skills you need for that are actually quite different from real combat. But his intention was to train his fencers for real combat on the street, on the field of honor, or on military campaign. Okay, and now we come to techniques and tactics. So de Grassi's system, as we've seen so far, might have to face off against similar rapier styles or cut and thrust styles of fencing, and it may be used on the street, on the military battlefield, on the field of honor for dueling. So it has to be applicable and adaptable to a wide variety of situations. And in fact, it is. It's a strongly principles-based system. So the way the book is written, it doesn't particularly assume that your opponent is fencing in one specific style, or even necessarily that they're using the same weapon as you. Although the examples in the book clearly do show fencers using the same style of sword and adopting the same guard postures, but that's probably just for convenience of training in the cell. He does actually refer to mismatched weapon situations on occasion in his book. For example, someone with a single-handed sword needing to take on somebody with a double-handed sword. So I do strongly believe that the system is adaptable to that sort of situation. Fundamentally, the opponent can only attack you by thrusting or cutting, and they can attack you to the inside line or the outside line. And this is a direct consequence of how de Grassi tells his fencers to stand on guard. By reducing the opponent's options to that very limited number, you can then respond using the principles of Grassi's true art of defense. I'm not going to go into those principles here because the video isn't really about them, but the fact of the matter is it doesn't matter what type of sword the opponent's holding in their hand, or how they've been trained to use it, or even if they're untrained in some way, they can only do this limited number of things. Attack inside, attack outside, attack by thrust, attack by cut. And Grassi's system contains all the tools you need to respond to those actions. It doesn't actually matter what your opponent is doing, or what they're thinking in their mind, or what their background in training is. They can only do those things, and Grassi's system gives you the tools to cope. So, to conclude, it is my strong belief that Grassi's system was designed for a wide variety of contexts and is readily adaptable to them. So that's something that's important to consider when you're training in the Grassi style. You cannot assume that your opponent is going to attack you in this very prescribed way, even if that's how we introduce the basics of the system in class. The point of the training exercises is to learn the principles, extract them, and then adapt them as necessary to cope with all these kinds of different situations. Now, that is not necessarily the case for all fencing treatises. There are definitely texts out there that assume a single combat between fencers in civilian clothes using identical or at least very similar weapons. For example, many small sword treatises assume this fact. But I don't believe that's really the case of Grassi's book. However, what systems do you study and what treatises have you read? How would you answer the question about context of use? And is the system a specialized one for countering other systems, or is it more adaptable than that? Is it designed for multi-purpose use? On that note, let's finish there for today. See you next time. Bye.